You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
All right, everybody, welcome to another Foreign Policy Focus and Around the Empire swapcast. I am the host of Foreign Policy Focus, Kyle Anzalone, and today Joanne Leone, host of Around the Empire, is joining me. Joanne, how are you doing?
Great, Kyle. Thanks so much for doing another swapcast. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, we actually had a day planned out for this and a different show planned, but kind of handed right to us, right. This whole Trump withdrawing from Syria, a deal between Assad and the Kurds. And so we thought we'd dedicate this show to talking about kind of what's developed in Syria in the past week, how it's, going to change the battlefield, and also going over a lot of the reactions to this, because it's been very interesting how many people are opposed to what Trump has done here, when in reality it now looks like we're going to have a lot of U.S. troops exiting that country. And I think we both agree that's a good idea. So be sure to check out either my podcast at the Libertarian Institute or Joanne's show. And Joanne, what's the best place to find your show?
Just go to aroundtheempire.com.
All right. So it was last Sunday now, that would be the 6th, I believe, of October or the 7th, that Donald Trump announced that he was going to be moving U.S. troops from the what Turkey has labeled the safe zone area of the Syria Turkish border east of the Euphrates River. And this was supposed to, I guess, push about 30 kilometers south of that border. So in total, this ended up being, I believe, 30 to 60 U.S. troops that were actually moved south. Although later I did read a story that said up to 100 U.S. special forces were in Kobani. And so maybe there was, 100 and something U.S. forces that were, possibly up in this area that were then just moved further south. Immediately this, invoked a lot of criticism of Donald Trump that he was betraying our Kurdish allies and had green-lighted a Turkish invasion and the setup of a safe zone in northern Syria. We get, as the week progresses, we have the build-up pretty much, I think, as far as I saw, Joanne, international condemnation of Turkey's decision to invade Syria here, whether it was from Europe, from, I believe, even China and Russia, all kind of said, hey, don't do this. And Turkey was insistent of pushing ahead here. The plan that Turkey at least had initially proposed was to take all the territory 30 kilometers south of the border in the M4 highway, which is an important road in Syria that, connects a lot of Syrian Kurdistan, I guess, to the rest of Syria. And so this is, important territory that Turkey would be taking here, and then resettling 2 million Syrian Arab refugees from other areas of Syria into this safe zone that they were creating. And so it seemed quite obvious that this was going to amount to something of an ethnic cleansing campaign, if not, some people were warning of an outright slaughter of the Kurds. I had talked about that, I think, a long-term occupation and likely a lot of Kurdish people being removed from their land. 800,000, I believe, of the 2 million Syrian Kurds lived in that area of the safe zone.
Yeah, I've heard that number too.
The Syrian Kurds also, I believe, had about 25,000 fighters in the area kind of ready to go. And I saw reports early on that the Syrian Kurds were saying that, hey, we're not going to fight them like we fought ISIS. We're going to go back to insurgency tactics. And so that seemed to me to be a recipe for a just long-term occupation of northeastern Syria. And I was really concerned about what would happen. The other downside is that at least up until or all through last week, Joanne, we had thought that this was only a limited number of U.S. troops being kind of redistributed in Syria rather than an outright withdrawal of that. But over the past weekend, we have learned that it looks like all 1,000 U.S. troops are coming home. I saw reports today. They're talking about this could happen not within a matter of weeks, but within a matter of days. And so it could be a very quick exit for at least all the U.S. troops in Syria that are east of the Euphrates River. There's still the Al-Tanaf base in South Syria on the border with Jordan. And so that's its own thing. But just talking about only Syria east of the Euphrates River, it now seems that U.S. troops will be exiting rather quickly. The other huge announcement that we got over the weekend was that the Syrian Kurds had cut a deal with the Assad government that I read today had been brokered and seems to be insured by Russia, that they are going to allow the Syrian government to take security, I guess, of most of eastern Syria now. I've read them moving into the towns of Manbij and Kobani in the north, and then Tabika, an important town along the Euphrates River Valley near Raqqa, with the dam that creates Lake Assad. And so all these kind of positions it seems the Assad government is moving into means that, the Syrian Kurds have agreed that, they're not going to break off and have their complete own autonomous zone in Syria as the Syrian civil war is finally wrapping up. Do you think I missed any other kind of important developments along the way here, Joanne?
No, I think that was really good. The part about the initial announcements being that now, we only had 50 U.S. troops in that area, and all we're doing is moving them south of the safe zone, quote unquote safe zone, which I never saw a final number on that safe zone, but I know that there were certain people saying that, Turkey wants that M4 highway that runs east to west, sort of parallel to the border, and whether or not they said that they were going to go down that far south, a lot of people were pretty convinced that they would. But, initially, just a couple of days ago, the game plan was that we were only moving 50 troops and we're just moving them down, and the Turks were going to create, this buffer between the Turkish border and the Kurdish held areas. We should be a little bit more specific. The SDF held areas. the SDF fighters are not entirely Kurdish, right? In fact, some people say that it's a majority Arab fighting force, but it's certainly under Kurdish leadership. We were just going to move south of the safe zone area and we were going to stay. And there were military officials reinforcing this message. And it wasn't until yesterday, the big break was when the Kurds announced that they were going to make a deal with the government in Damascus, with Russia as the guarantor, as you said. And that changed everything. Yeah, that really just, ended the war to some extent.
I was thinking that I should add, if, Turkey had started the invasion of Syria, it seemed, using a combination of what I believe they were calling the Syrian National Army, but it's just different kind of groups thrown together, supported by Turkey under the Free Syrian Army banner. So, probably some more moderate rebels, Arabs, and versus some real jihadist types, possibly, and foreign fighters in that group. And then, actual Turkish soldiers carrying out artillery and airstrikes into Syria. There were reports of assassination of captured SDF troops, as well as captured Kurdish political leaders by the Free Syrian Army and Turkish Ba'ath forces. I didn't read any reports of the Turkish soldiers themselves, taking anybody out back and shooting them execution style. But nonetheless, they're, jihadist linked groups were more than willing to do that to the Syrian Kurds. And it was after a couple days of this that the Syrian Kurds ended up cutting the deal with Assad. And so I just wanted to throw that in there. And also the threat of sanctions that Donald Trump said. So initially he says he's going to pull back. And then, pretty quickly after the negative reaction, he starts threatening sanctions against Turkey to wreck the Turkish economy and everything like that. And so maybe that's something we could talk about later on. But I think it is worth noting that Donald Trump has threatened heavy-handed sanctions against Turkey for carrying out war crimes in Syria.
Yeah, I mean, he's sort of portraying the situation as though he had control of what Turkey does, because he had this phone conversation with Erdogan, and Erdogan, promised to only go a certain distance. My understanding is they've already reached that agreed upon distance. And, that's when Trump started yelling that you better not go any further, or, well, I guess he initiated this threat initially. He said something like, we're going to crash your economy if you don't hold up your end of the deal, do what you said you were going to do. He's a little bit all over the place, but he always goes back to, let me see what he said this morning. He's lashing out at Fox and Friends, the show that he loves. Every morning he says, Brian Kilmeade over at Fox and Friends got it all wrong. We are not going into another war between people who've been fighting with each other for 200 years. Europe had a chance to get their ISIS prisoners, but they didn't want the cost. Let the USA pay, they said. The Kurds may be releasing some, he means ISIS prisoners, to get us involved, easily recaptured by Turkey or European nations from where many came. But they should move very quickly. Big sanctions on Turkey are coming. Do people really think we should go to war with a NATO member, Turkey? Never-ending wars will end. The same people who got us into the Middle East mess are the people who most want to stay there. So that's his latest comment. But he has flip-flopped it back a little bit. But I think that his speech, I think it was on the 10th, it was just maybe 4 days ago, he had a huge rally in Minneapolis. And there were real problems with this rally. Like the mayor of Minneapolis was trying to prevent him from even coming to do this rally. It's one of those big stadium rallies. And, of course, that didn't work. He still came, did the rally. But outside there were thousands of protesters, and it was a bit chaotic, but it was still the usual Trump rally. And he gave like a 13 to 15 minute long segment of that speech was about ending the wars, ending the endless wars. And he went on a long talk about what it's like when the casualties, basically when a dead soldier arrives at Dover Air Base and he's there, he's seen it, the reactions of the families. And then he goes on to talk about his visits to Walter Reed, which is the large hospital complex in the Washington, D.C. area where a lot of our wounded troops are treated for the really serious injuries. And he gives anecdotes about one particular one he talks to. And he just goes on about how he wants to end these endless wars. And I think, a lot of people think of course, he's on the campaign trail. He hasn't kept many of his promises from his 2016 campaign. So, he wants to show that they have this phrase, I think, promises made, promises kept. And, of course, it's the politician in him, but there was something sincere in the way he said it and what he said too. So I kind of thought that at that point he had already decided to do this, that he was going to make this move. We should remember too, he is under impeachment threat right now. I think everybody knows that. And the one firewall he has is the Senate. The Republicans control the Senate, and the conventional wisdom is now that the Democrats who control the House are going to go forward with some kind of an impeachment. And then, of course, the next step is that the House sort of, quote unquote, indicts, and then the Senate performs the trial and decides whether or not to remove the president. And so the conventional wisdom is that the Republicans aren't going to do that. They're either going to say, nah, they're going to just throw it out and say we're not going to hold a trial, or they're going to do some kind of, pro forma. They're going to do some minimal thing and find him, not guilty, and he's going to stay in office. So right now, the reactions to this is very complicated politically here, because you have the foreign policy Borg, as some people call it, is bipartisan. There are no party lines on these wars. The elected officials in Congress typically support these wars, and they support the military-industrial complex. And they have, some of them have conflicted alliances to various allies. And so this move that he made, I think, definitely endangered his position, that firewall that he has in the Senate. I think there's a bigger chance now that Republicans will turn on him. And I think he has there's a bigger chance of him being removed from office. I don't know. I mean, because they should look at the reaction from the American public to gauge that decision. But it remains to be seen whether they will. I guess I went off on a little tangent there, but I think it's an important aspect.
I think we're at the point we want to be now, though, talking about the Borg and their reaction. And I think the kind of first reaction I want to talk to you about, Joanne, was that Trump was somehow morally responsible for what Turkey was about to do to the Syrian Kurds. And that, I guess, implies that he could have stopped it. And that's just one thing that I've kind of noticed. I got that story here from Newsweek from October 11th saying that there were some U.S. forces, special forces still in Kobani, and they came under mortar fire from the Turkish army. And so I guess I first kind of wonder if, Donald Trump had told Erdogan that, no, I'm not moving U.S. forces and, that they're going to be a tripwire. So if you went all out war with America, then you go right ahead and roll in and kill those Americans. But, you're not going to do that. You're not going to carry out this invasion. I think Erdogan would have said, the Kurds are the biggest threat to my country and I'm going in and you U.S. troops better get out of the way. I think he was very willing to engage in that game of chicken with Donald Trump, and Trump, maybe having some respect for those Americans and realizing that, when those caskets come home of Turks of Americans who were killed by Turks and this stupid thing of putting them in front of Kurds, that he couldn't live with that. And so, maybe it was partly, that realization, or just that, once he realized that Turkey was coming, there wasn't, the consensus from the Pentagon probably wasn't, oh, well, we need to take the side of the Syrian Kurds. There's a lot of debate within the Pentagon of whether, to support Turkey and kind of just leave the Kurds or not. This is European Command and NATO because Turkey is a member versus CENTCOM. So with all that complication, I don't know if Trump really had much of a choice here other than to move those U.S. troops. Now, I think removing all of them, I guess, is maybe something he had a little more leverage with, and decide to do that, which is a good thing. But I don't know how he could be morally responsible if Turkey was going to come in and take out the Kurds, unless, I guess, the U.S. went to war with Turkey.
Yeah. And he's a convenient person to blame right now for just years of compounding mistakes, in my opinion. But yeah, here's the thing that people are not talking about. Going back to, I don't know, at least like 2014-ish, Erdogan's demand has been a buffer zone, a safe zone all along the border. This is something he's been pushing for from the start. And the call for it, the demand for it has only become more and more defiant and urgent over the years. And, sort of what it all boils down to is, are we willing to give up a NATO ally and actually maybe end up at war with a NATO ally or not? Are we or are we not? This has been Obama's not getting the blame for bringing the Kurds into this and, creating the SDF, but they did create the SDF, right? So when they did that, they knew, and everybody knew at that point in time, that this was an irreconcilable difference. Turkey and the SDF were never going to sort of become friends. And yet, every time I remember listening to Pentagon press conferences, and people would ask, well, you're doing this with the SDF and now they're going to move out of Kurdish areas, and they're going to help take Raqqa and so on and so forth. What about Turkey? And nobody ever had an answer for that. Oh, they would just say, the generals would say things like, we value our Turkish allies and blah, blah, blah. And it didn't resolve anything. So this giant elephant in the room has been sitting there, what looked to me to be, maybe there was some kind of reconciliation, but it looked like an irreconcilable difference that just kept getting put off and put off and put off. And, to some extent, our troops in those areas were like shields, right? They were keeping the Turks from attacking our allies. So I never agreed with putting him in that position to begin with, but.
Well, I can just expand real quick here. At times, that is literal, where around the town of Manbij, Syria, Joanne, you'll probably remember, there were U.S., I believe, Army Rangers would drive around in Humvees with big American flags on them between the Turkish-backed Syrian Arab Army, or not Arab Army, Syrian Free Army troops, and then the U.S.-backed SDF. and they would take fire during those kind of missions of driving around. So yes, quite literally acting as shields. That was the value that the U.S. Commander in Chief put on the lives of those Americans, which is always astounding to me that we've somehow gotten to the point where America is so great that we will act as human shields to keep our allies from shooting at each other. It's quite insane.
Right. And the whole issue of we betrayed the Kurds. Well, yeah, I think we did to some extent. It's not quite that simple. And as I had mentioned to you earlier, Kyle, there's an article on foreign policy by, sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, but Muslim Adi, who's the commander of the SDF. And he basically wrote an article saying why they cut a deal with the Syrian government with the Russians as the guarantor. And he says, if we have to choose between compromise and genocide, we will choose our people. I guess that's pretty obvious, right? So you weren't going to be able to fight Turkey. He gives an explanation, which I think is pretty obvious. I don't really need to read that. But they also cite an article from January 2019. That's the last time all of this was going to come to a head. And they say Trump's decision. So I'm quoting a January 2019 defense post that's referenced in this op-ed by the SDF commander. It says Trump's decision came as a shock to Syrian democratic officials. And here, the person speaking now is Salah Muslim, which is the former co-chair of the PYD. PYD is the political party associated with the YPG, the Kurdish party. And he says, we always knew the Americans would leave, but not at this time. From the beginning of the U.S. presence in Syria, in every meeting with Brett McGurk, they never promised us a political solution or support for our political project. They said, we are working with you only to fight ISIS. It's just that the timing of this withdrawal is wrong. The Americans told us clearly, we are not with you to fight the Syrian army. We're with you to fight ISIS. For your political project, you choose it, and we support you, but no negotiations or discussion. It was just political speech. So that's why we always maintain contacts with the Russians, because they said they will support our project on the ground and help us find a solution to this. But until now, nothing is official. The Russians are not saying to us that they will support a decentralized Syria. So I think what he's saying there is they realized all along that in order to get their longer term goal, an autonomous region, a federalized Syria where they have more control over their lives and their own protection, things like that, they knew the Americans weren't going to be able to get that for them. It was going to be the Russians mediating with the Syrian government. So I think that's really important when you're considering the betrayal thing. Now, pulling out at the drop of a hat and leaving them in sudden danger, that's a different story. And I don't necessarily agree with that. But I want to put one caveat on that. Assuming that Trump had a choice of doing it another way, and it seems like he would have a choice of doing it another way. But let me just mention one more thing, Kyle, as to whether I have doubts whether he had that choice to do it any differently than he did. And that's the sort of epic deal between Kerry and Lavrov in 2016. Remember when they were constantly negotiating. They had all kinds of people at tables and this and that. And remember, they finally came up with a deal in late 2016. And there were ceasefires, were part of the arrangement. There were agreements to sort out the moderate rebels, the extremists from the moderates, and who should be protected and who shouldn't. And Aleppo was still on the brink at that point. And there was an agreement to bring humanitarian aid into Aleppo. And the final and the sort of very big, significant part of that deal was that if the ceasefire held and everything worked out with the deal they made, after a week or some period of time, the United States and the coalition and the Russian military were going to start formal cooperation in Syria. And they made that deal. They wrangled over it for a long time. And then there was like a hotel in Switzerland somewhere, and the place was filled with the media. And they were in a room and they were negotiating, Kerry and Lavrov and their aides. And it was going all through the night. And the Russians were like, come on, because apparently Kerry had like a 5-hour video conference with Washington where he was arguing, and eventually Obama overrode Ash Carter or the Pentagon or whatever faction was objecting to this agreement. Obama finally said, we're doing it. They made the deal. I mean, remember the whole thing where Kerry brought in the pizzas for all the media, and then Lavrov brought in the vodka, and it was a really big thing. The whole world was watching. So they made this deal. Everybody was pretty happy about it. And within a short period of time, a few days or 5 days, we accidentally bombed Syrian troops, killed 62 Syrian troops. And they weren't just any troops. They were in this besieged airbase in Deir ez-Zor that this sort of infamous Syrian general and his troops had held somehow for like 2 or 2.5 or 3 years against ISIS. They were literally surrounded. They had to be supplied by airdrops. And it was sort of a miracle that they were able to even hold this position. And those are the troops that we bombed. We claimed it was an accident, but it just blew that whole deal right up. So there's clearly different factions, some of whom want to resolve these things, want to negotiate. And there's clearly another faction, and they have airplanes, who doesn't. And they sabotage that deal. So did Trump really have a choice or not? I don't know.
I mean, I think that's a great analysis of the whole thing, Joanne. I mean, the betrayal question is a big one. And yeah, I completely agree with you. Although the one thing I'll say is that quote you read about the, Syrian Kurds acknowledging that the U.S. said, hey, we're not here to help you establish a state in January of this year. That's a pretty big window to make something work. And especially if Donald Trump did kind of had to drop this as a bomb. Maybe it was a situation that, either, first of all, Erdogan called him and said, hey, I'm invading tomorrow, or Trump felt like there was no way to do it other than to do it quickly, or else it would be sabotaged and, further provoke tensions between the U.S. and our NATO allies in Turkey. And so he was making the decision that he would just kind of do it rapidly for that reason. Certainly that's kind of what we saw the first time he tried to withdraw from Syria, is that they basically just slow played him on the whole thing. And we never withdrew any troops from Afghanistan, it seems, and maybe took about 1,000 out of Syria, but that may even be a high-end estimate depending on how many are still stationed down in Al-Tanaf. And so it's just been really interesting of how, the politics kind of work in DC. And it's not that, this is the way I would prefer to go for the Syrian Kurds at all. No. Obviously, just like Afghanistan, if we could get the, Afghan government to negotiate with the Taliban before leaving, all the better. Absolutely. Like, get a situation where they could all have like their lines drawn up on maps, and they know that, this road or this province is, Taliban autonomous, and this one is government, and we're just not going to fight over it anymore. And that's the deal. And I'm sure it won't, make Afghanistan peaceful, but it would certainly help. And so if Trump had, announced something like that going into it, that would have been better. But maybe he just didn't have the ability to work that out. And it's because of all the people who are attacking Trump the most, Lindsey Graham, Brett McGurk, all the Obama administration officials, that this is the situation. You know what I mean? And they're the ones condemning Trump the loudest. And it's just that irony is hard to get over sometimes. But I did want to move into the reaction of Brett McGurk specifically. He was the former Obama. Was he appointed under Obama, or was he just Trump's guy?
He was appointed he was appointed under Obama, and he continued under Trump. Yeah, he was the envoy to the, I don't remember the exact name, but he was the guy that was supposed to work this all out.
Yeah, I think special envoy to Syria, because it wasn't like technically an ambassadorship or something. But why don't you go ahead and explain kind of what McGurk had to say?
Yeah, now there are many reactions. There's food fights all over Twitter and I don't know, all over the place with this, because in cable news it's mostly condemnation of Trump, and this is horrible, and ISIS prisoners are being released, and this is terrible for us, and the Kurds are being slaughtered. And yeah, some of these, Turkey's Free Syrian Army is now rebranded again And these are all the same guys that we armed and backed and tried to, get them to fight as our proxies. Now they're with Turkey. I guess they kind of always were with Turkey, at least some of them. Anyway, that's complicated. But these guys are not unfamiliar to us, right? So Brett McGurk, let me just talk first about two guys who I think most of our listeners will be familiar with, Charles Lister and this guy Hassan, and mostly Lister. Lister is a think tank guy he's the one who said we have 70,000 moderate rebels and they're going to fight on our side and blah, blah, blah. And he's an apologist for Al-Qaeda and he's just a loathsome creature all around, to be honest. But there's someone named Aris Rosinos tweeted this. He said, Brett McGurk said to him. He said, Brett McGurk to me. He said, listen, Hassan and all the usual suspects supported this nonsense plan, and to this day, even after the world has seen Turkish-backed Oppo behead people on the M4 highway, insist we had some alternative to the SDF. They got a lot of people killed. Okay, so this created an explosive reaction from both Charles Lister himself. When he saw this, he had a complete meltdown. He said, what a disgrace. Brett McGurk knows full well what I and others proposed from the get-go, and it wasn't an either-or. It was from day one that as hard as it was, some form of balance between the opposition and the YPG was necessary. If you can't see that now, God help you. I mean, let's be real. This coming from the man who, one, chose to back Maliki in Iraq to the huge benefit of ISIS, and then two, went all in with the YPG in Syria, bluffing Turkey on a self-perceived existential security threat. That's some huge success there. Oh, and also the groups we're watching commit war crimes in northeast Syria today are not the groups that were in the Kurds in 2014, 2015. This is not true as far as I know. Moreover, many involved today and many not involved were already being backed by the U.S. to fight Assad. This is a malicious distraction. And then he says, it will never fail to amaze me how otherwise serious, reputable people will swallow up and amplify nasty accusations about others online without having the decency to check facts before doing so. How many policy papers have I written on ISIS since 2016? 0. So he's really furious that he might get some of the blame for all this, and mostly because the Gurks said they have blood on their hands. And Hassan, he reacted, and he said, wow, a former U.S. presidential envoy to ISIS, Brett McGurk, is implying I have blood on my hands for proposing a Syria plan. What a ludicrous thing to say. Brett is upset. We called him out on the failures from ISIS rise from the ashes in 14 to the very mess unfolding today. First, I never ran U.S. policy. McGurk did, and he was completely wrong about backing Maliki, the man who led ISIS into Iraq. That was the single biggest mistake the U.S. ever made after the invasion of Iraq. All the gains accomplished against al-Qaeda in Iraq were squandered. Interestingly, Obama's team, which included McGurk, accepted that this was a mistake. So they insisted on removing Maliki before providing support for Iraq against ISIS. But ironically, put McGurk in charge of the very mess he contributed to. So anyway, you get the sense. The blame is getting thrown all over the place. And then McGurk himself, he's blaming Trump. And he's saying he cites a Washington Post op-ed that he says U.S. military forces withdrawing from the Northeast, that what had been the ISIS caliphate, all without thought, process, or planning, there will be serious consequences for our national security well beyond Syria. For now, may our people get out safely. The disaster unfolding tonight in Syria was predictable from the moment Trump made clear that he wanted to leave. And then he cites his Washington Post op-ed after he resigned 10 months ago. And so you can see all the blame sort of being flung all over the place. Trump is a convenient target because even all these guys who either backed different policies or backed these quote unquote moderate rebels, or in Brett McGurk's case, I think he was in an impossible situation to begin with, but he made a lot of these deals and helped make these decisions. And then just the last thing I'll mention is that there are people on the sidelines, people like Dan Cohen and Max Blumenthal, who have been criticizing Lister all along, and they're calling up a lot of inconvenient truths of what Lister really did and what Lister really said, including at a conference saying that Al-Qaeda largely got it right, he said. And I have a clip of that if we want to add that later, Kyle, where there he is saying, this Al-Qaeda, and they're a lot more moderate than ISIS. And, in Syria, they really got it right. And there was a period of time, we all remember, when there was a sentiment out there, which you would think would be just completely forbidden in this country after almost 20 years of post 9/11 Al-Qaeda. You know what I'm saying. So,
right, we're still fighting in Afghanistan, so how the hell can we take the side of Al-Qaeda? Like,
and across the border, we're not,
Right. It's absolutely crazy. Talking about the Islamic State, though, that's another criticism that's been thrown around against Trump. And again, I think one that we're going to say at least has some, maybe, just this is what's going to happen. Yeah. They're warning about maybe the rise of ISIS again. That they seem way out in front of themselves on that. I don't think that's true. But it doesn't mean that a few hundred maybe ISIS detainees. I know a few of the family members escaped, and that seems to be more of a complicated issue to me. Like these children of ISIS fighters, like how long are you going to lock them up for? And so if they escape, then that's, not the same as the ISIS guy escaping or something. But, maybe a few ISIS prisoners do escape, or at least people alleged to have been in ISIS, because who knows, I'm sure there's been a lot of innocent people to have been convicted and possibly even put to death, for being members of the Islamic State when they weren't. But anyways, some of these people may escape, and so that may lead to a slight increase in the amount of havoc ISIS is able to wreak in the region, but that doesn't mean that it's a long-term problem or it's a threat to the United States. And I think that's an important point distinction, and I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
No, pretty much I'm with you on that. I mean, it's terrible that we're in this position. Some of the prisons were insecure. I don't even know exactly what happened to preceded that jailbreak that happened, but they got it, someone got it on film. I don't know. I don't know. I do know that there are people slaughtering other people in that part of northeast Syria, and that's horrible. And I mainly blame the Turks for that, but how can you, this is just an enormously complicated situation. Everybody's got their own motivations, their history, their grudges, and I don't know. It should be clear that we can't fix all this stuff. It can't be fixed. These countries are going to have to fix things themselves. And, Turkey, they paint this as a security issue, and I'm sure there is some kind of security issue. I don't know. But it's also, they're very ambitious. They're expansionary, and you can find that in various Erdogan supporters. And Erdogan has still never forgotten that 2016 coup attempt against him either. And that really complicated the whole situation. And then the one other thing we didn't mention is that I've seen from some credible people, the reactions in a couple of towns in northeast Syria where one thing that was pretty amazing and makes me think that this wasn't entirely a surprise is how fast the Syrian army moved in. I mean, they were they must have been waiting on the other side of the river, because they moved in to Hasaka very quickly, and Kamlishi, and there are videos of great celebration. So none of these cities are entirely Kurdish or entirely Arabic, entirely Christian or Yazidi. So, some part of the population is very happy and welcomed the Syrian army, who came in mainly in pickup trucks. This army's been fighting for 8 years, and I guess I don't know what kind of equipment they have, but they definitely got a big welcome. There is some part of this population that, well, first of all, they're happy that, they're going to protect them from Turkey, but they also seem to be happy that this army's moving in.
Yeah, now that I think about it, Joanne, that seems to be a powerful point that Syria was able to move in so quickly, just because we know there's also an offensive going on for Idlib. Right. And you would think that if Syria is fighting in Idlib and didn't expect this at all, that they may not have had troops all set and ready to go. And, that they'd probably, I'm guessing with the amount of towns and amount of places they're moving, this is a significant amount of troops and equipment, fuel, resources that all go into this. And so they, maybe had to move a lot further. had, maybe Assad not had some forewarning about this, or, even Russia just kind of passing along, hey, you might want to free some people up in the east over there. So I don't know how all this works behind the scenes, but that too to me does seem to be an indication that maybe there was something going on behind the scenes. But that's a little bit more me guessing. Before we wrap up, Joanne, I did want to talk to you about the Democratic Party's reaction. Something I've kind of talked to you about throughout the election cycle now was what the candidates on that side are saying about war. And, it was terrible. It was shockingly terrible. I thought that, maybe a couple of them, in the past have, kind of said that, hey, I agree with the president on leaving Syria, universal, condemnation. The only one who I would say had a little bit more of a nuanced view and I thought was a little bit more on point was Tulsi Gabbard. At the time she tweeted, that the U.S. is just moving troops, and to public knowledge at that time that was true. I was saying the same thing, but also really laid into the whole, Trump lied to and blindsided the Kurds and betrayed them. So that was a little disappointing. But what did you think, Joanna, about pretty much, I guess, universal condemnation, including from Hillary Clinton, one of the people who, kind of put this whole thing in motion?
Well, I haven't checked every presidential candidate's reaction, but I think the only reaction that is allowed is to lash out at Trump, to say it was a betrayal of the Kurds and it was a rash, impulsive decision, and, it endangered our troops and all of this stuff. And basically what they're doing is Chuck Schumer, and this doesn't surprise me, the position he took right off the bat was that Trump is siding with dictators, Putin, Erdogan, and Assad. These are brutal dictators, and he is siding with them, and, just another reason to impeach him. But what they're doing in substantive is they are supposedly creating some kind of a bipartisan resolution in Congress where they say that they're going to pass some kind of legislation that's going to force him to undo what he just did, which is pretty ridiculous. But that is their reaction. That's, I think, mostly a political reaction. I don't think they really believe that they can really affect, first of all, the commander-in-chief's decision. I mean, when Obama got us into this thing, he didn't get anything from nobody asked anybody. This is an illegal invasion, like top to bottom. And, even if you try to justify it with the original AUMF from back in 2001, that AUMF says that you have to fight against somebody who had something to do with 9/11. And the reality of this is that we were on Al-Qaeda's side in this war. So I don't know how you can use that AUMF to justify this war, without going to Congress or getting any kind of, or the UN Security Council or anything. So it's pretty messy. I don't quite know how they're going to do this, but that's what they've chosen to do, Kyle. They're pretty much whatever you see on cable news. That's the position that most Democrats are taking.
All right. So it seems to be that what you're saying to me is that, because Donald Trump is betraying an ally, Congress is trying to take up and force a declaration of war against Turkey, a NATO ally, to force Trump to go to war against the wishes of the president. Is that pretty much right?
Yeah, I haven't seen the wording of whatever this thing is they're going to come up, whether it's just going to be a sense of the Senate condemning Trump or demanding that he do this or that. I don't quite know what the wording on this thing's going to be, but that's what they say they're going to do.
But that's what he's asking. That it's, Turkey is saying that they're fighting a counterterrorism operation in Syria. I mean, they're saying they're building a peace zone or whatever, but they say the YPG are terrorists. And so, with YPG operating in the area, then they're fighting a terrorist insurgency there, right? And so the U.S. is going to go back the terrorists. Doesn't that, that puts us at war with Turkey in all practical sense.
Yeah,
so,
pretty much.
I just want to make it clear that I'm pretty sure that's what the Congress is asking Trump to do. It's just so crazy.
Yeah, and the craziest thing, Kyle, is that Congress never authorized this war to stay in it. And now they're going to introduce some resolution to disallow withdrawing from it. That's just how crazy our world is now.
All right, Joanne. Well, I guess we should wrap up before we get too long here today. It was great to talk to you again. I hope to do another one of these swapcasts soon. My show, Foreign Policy Focus. Joanne's show, Around the Empire. Find mine at the Libertarian Institute. Around the Empire is aroundtheempire.com. And Joanne, I know you try to build up that YouTube page. I hope that's going well for you. Make sure you subscribe to that thing because YouTube really works against people with their algorithms. So work hard on that one.
Thanks, Kyle.
All right. Anything else?
Nope. Great talking with you. And thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.